smoky winter dusk begins to settle over the railway station at Crewe. Its first-class waiting room grows steadily more stagnant. The grimed windows do little more than sift the failing light, and the massive black leather furniture becomes less and less inviting. It appears to have been made for a scene of extreme and diabolical violence that one may hope will never occur. Things like this become exaggerated in memory, and the afternoon I have in mind is many years distant, but I certainly became more conscious of the defects of my surroundings when my fellow passengers hurried out for the down train, leaving me to wait for the up. And nothing, and nobody, as I supposed, but a drowsy fire for company. The animated talk before we parted had been occasioned by an account in the morning's newspapers of the last voyage of the Hesper. She'd come in the evening before, days overdue, and even her master had not refused to admit that certain mysterious and tragic events had occurred on board, though he preferred not to discuss them. He agreed, however, that his ship was at present in want of a second mate. But the voyage of the Hesper is now, of course, an old tale many times told, and I myself, having wearied of her mysteries, had decided to seek out the refreshment room, when a voice behind me suddenly broke the hush. It was an unusual voice, rapid, incoherent. I shifted my chair and turned to look. Evidently this, the only other occupant of the room, had until this moment been as unaware of my presence as I of his. He seemed for a moment to be in doubt even of what I was. "I'm sorry," I said. "I supposed—" "Merely what I was saying, sir, is that those gentlemen who have just left us had no more notion of what they were talking about than an infant in the cradle." "How so?" I said. "I'm only a landsman myself, but—" He shifted a little nearer, a smallish man, muffled up in a very respectable greatcoat, at least 2 sizes too large for him. "You don't have to go to sea for things like that. But they'll find out all right, all in good time." He glanced around him. "You know where you are in a place like this, though. It's solid." "Yes, I agree. It certainly looks solid."
"Ah, looks. But what is your solid, sir?"
With that he rose and seated himself opposite me, and I must confess that now that he was near, I did not much care for the appearance of this stranger. In spite of his admirable greatcoat, he looked in need of a barber, as well as of medicine and sleep, a need that might presently exhibit itself in a hankering for alcohol. But I was mistaken. He asked for nothing. He just wanted company, human company. He merely, it seemed, wanted to talk about himself, suddenly plunged into his past.
"I was a gentleman's servant when I began, sir," he set off. "First boot boy, then footman, and so on. Never married. Petticoats are nothing but encumbrances in the house. But I must say, if you keep yourself to yourself, it sees you through in time. What you have to beware of is those of your own calling. Domestic. That's the same everywhere. Nobody's reached much past the cat and dog stage in that. Jealousy. And if you don't stay where you're put, there's precious little chance of pickings when the funeral's at the door. The last situation I was in was with the Reverend Gİğᴏsᴛ, in the depths of the country. Just myself, a young fellow by the name of George, and a woman who came in from the village. How long the Reverend hadn't cared for females in the house I never knew, but he was attached enough to his sister. Quite a nice lady, but we had to look alive when she was in the house. Oh, yes, but that, thank God, was seldom. She never took to the vicarage. I can hear her now, Blake this and Blake that. Too dark, too vaulty, too shut in. Trees in the front, everlastings, though open behind with cornfields. You could see for miles from the upper corridor windows, small panes that take a lot of cleaning, but George did the windows. George had come from the village, nothing but a few cottages. Why the old church lay a mile away from it, I can't say. The Reverend had private means, naturally. I knew that before it came out in the will. He was a gentleman. Give him his books, and tomorrow, like yesterday, and he gave no trouble. Mind you, he liked things as they should be. Everything had to be punctual to the minute, and the good things good. I've never seen choicer fruit than came from his houses and orchard. Though it was here the trouble began. But it was an easy place, and fair prospects too, if you could wait. The Reverend told me himself that he'd remembered me in his will, if still in his service. You know how these lawyers put it. In fact, he'd given me to understand that if in the meantime any of us went elsewhere, the one left was to have the lot, but not death. There it turned out I was in error. But I'm not complaining. I've enough to see me through however long I'm left. I might have stayed to this day if the old gentleman's gardener cared to stay too. He began it. Him gone, we all went. And that's where these fine gentlemen here were talking around their hats. What I say is, keep on this side of the tomb as long as you can. Don't meddle with that hole. They seem to forget there may be some mighty unpleasant meetings. And what about the further shore? It's my belief there's some kind of ferry plying on that river, and coming back depends on what you want to come back for. Anyhow, they said the old house was haunted. A previous vicar had even had the place exorcised, candles and holy water, that kind of thing. Sheer flummery, I call it. If at the beginning there was anything in that house that was better out than in, it never troubled me, at least not at first. No, I'm not complaining. Live at peace with who you can, I say. But when it comes to as crusty a customer, and a Scotchman at that, as was the gardener, then there's a limit. Mengus, he called himself. He lived down at the lodge, and his widowed daughter kept house for him, with one little boy, harmless enough as children go, but noisy, and not for the house. Now why, I ask you, shouldn't I pick a little of this gentleman's precious fruit, or a cucumber for a salad, with our Mr. Mengus busy with the frames? I don't hold with all these hard and fast restrictions, at least outside the house. Not he, though. We wrangled about it week in, week out, and him with a temper which once roused was past all reasoning. Not that I ever took much notice of him until it came to a point past any man's enduring. But duty is duty, and when a man takes advantage of what is meant in pure friendliness, well, one's bound to make a move. What I mean to say is, I used occasionally, pantry window wide open and all that, I used occasionally to offer our friend a drink. But it came to become a kind of habit, and to be expected, which is always a bad condition of things. Well, there came along, 5 years ago, you may remember, an extraordinary hot summer, and an early harvest necessarily, and gardening is thirsty work, I will say that for it, which, being so, better surely virgin water, or a drop of cider, than ardent spirits. It stands to reason. Besides, we had had words again. Let him get his own drinks, was my feeling, and you can hardly call me to blame if he did. There was the pantry window hanging wide open, and there was the ruin of him within arm's reach from outside. I'd watch him there, though he couldn't see me, being behind the door. And practices like that, sir, as you will agree with me, can't go on. It had gone too far. And then I came down one morning to find one of my best decanters smashed to smithereens on the floor, Irish glass and all. Cats and sherry, you ever heard of it? And out of revenge, he filled the pantry with wasps by bringing in overripe plums. And so things went from bad to worse. A widower, too, with a married daughter dependent on him. No, sir, I had to call a halt to it. A friendly word in his ear, you may be thinking, might have sufficed. Believe me, not for him. Then I thought of George, not compromising myself in any way, of course, in so doing. I said to him one day, George, a word in time saves 9, but it would be better coming from you than me. You take me? Hold your peace till our friend's sober, then hand it to him. A word of warning, I mean. Say we're muffling things up as well as we can from the old gentleman, but that if he should hear of it, there'd be fat in the fire, and no mistake. You'd take it easier from you, George, the responsibility being mine. Lord, how I remember George. He had a way of looking at you as if he couldn't say bo to a goose. Bolting blue eyes, as simple as an infant's. But he wasn't stupid, oh no. And now I reflect, I think he knew our little plan wouldn't work. But there, whatever he might be thinking, he was so awkward with his tongue that he could never find anything to say until it was too late, so I left it at that. What he actually did say I never knew. But the very next afternoon, our friend came along to the pantry window and stood there looking in, swaying he was, but not with drink, just fury. "Where's that George of yours?" he said. "Fetch him out. I'll teach him to play the Holy Moses to my daughter. Fetch him out, and we'll finish it here and now." "I don't want to meddle in anybody's quarrels," I said pleasantly. "So long as George does his work as will satisfy my eye, I am not responsible for his actions in his off time." How was I to know, may I ask, if it was not our Mr. Menges who had smashed one of my best decanters? "George is a quiet, unbeseeming young fellow," I said, "and if he thinks it's his duty to report any misgoings-on, either to me or to the Reverend, it doesn't concern anyone else." That seemed to sober my fine gentleman. Mind you, I'm not saying there was anything really wrong with him. He was a first-rate gardener, I grant you that. I noticed he was looking a bit pinched, hollow under the eyes, sleepless nights perhaps. But how was I to know his precious grandson was out of sorts with a bad throat, I ask you? "The best thing you and George can do," I went on, "is to bury the hatchet, and out of hearing of the house, too." With that, I turned away, leaving him to think things over. What else could I have done, sir? There was little light of day left in our cavernous waiting-room by this time, only the glow of the fire and the phosphorescence of the gaslights. "If he was anxious about his grandson," I ventured, "it might explain his short temper." "Well, sir, you'd hardly go as far as to say that anxiety over his grandson would excuse him for what was little short of manslaughter. Keeping facts as facts, if you'll excuse me, our friend waylaid George by the stables that evening, and a wonderful evening it was, shepherd's delight and all that. But to judge from the looks of the young fellow's face when he came into the house, there hadn't been much of that in the time they'd had together." I said, "Sponge it down, George, and maybe the old gentleman won't notice anything wrong." It wasn't to reason I could let him off his duties. But as for the Reverend's not noticing it, there, as luck would have it, I was wrong. For some time later, George came along to me snuffling as if he'd been crying, and all that I could get out of him was that he had concocted some story to account for his looks, the like of which nobody in his senses would credit. And the next thing I heard was that our Mr. Menges had been called into the house and given the sack there and then. Well, our friend came rapping at the back door that evening, shaken to the marrow if ever a man was, and just livid. I told him, and I meant it too, that I was sorry for what had occurred. I told him too that the only hope left was to let bygones be bygones. Not he. He said, and he was sober enough then in all conscience, that come what may, here or hereafter, he'd be even with him. Aye, and he made mention of me also, but not so rabid. A respectable man too, never a word against him till then, and not far short of 60, and then— The old creature paused until a mainline train had gone roaring through. And then, though he wasn't found till morning, he must have gone straight out, said good-bye to nobody. He must have gone straight out to the old barn and hanged himself. And it's my belief that it wasn't so much the disgrace of the affair, but his daughter and grandson that were preying on his mind, and yet, why, he never so much as asked me to say a good word for him, not one. Well, that was the end of that, so far. And it's a curious thing to me how going back over the past clears everything up like, at least for the time being. But it's what we were saying just now about what's solid that sets me thinking. I've been told, sir, that after cremation we amount to no more than what you could put into a walnut. And my point, sir, my point is this, that if that's all there is to you and me, we shouldn't need much of the substantial for what you might call the mere soul look of things, if you follow me, if we chose or chanced to come back. When gone, I mean. Just enough, I suppose, to be obnoxious, as the Reverend used to say, to the naked eye. But all that, being as it may be, the whole thing had tidied over, and George was pretty nearly himself again when I began to notice something peculiar. At first, maybe, a little more than mere silence. There was a strain, so to speak, as you went about your daily doings, especially after dark, and I could see that even George had noticed it, and he had hardly noticed a black beetle on a pancake. And then came something you could put word to. I'd gone out one evening after a broiling hot day to get a little air. I was thinking over what a curious thing is how one man's poison is another man's meat. For the funeral over and all that, the old gentleman had thanked me for all I'd done. You see, what had gone before had been a hard break in his trust of a man, and he'd looked up from his bed at me almost with tears in his eyes. He said he wouldn't forget it. He used the word substantial, sir, and I ought by rights to have mentioned that he was taken ill the night of the inquest, a sort of stroke, the doctor said, though he came round, I must say, remarkably well considering his age. Well, I've been thinking all this over as I walked back to the house along the field path, when I looked up, as if at a call, and saw, what I take my oath, I'll never remembered to have seen there before, a scarecrow. A scarecrow, in the middle of the cornfield at the back of the vicarage. Nothing funny in that, you may say, but this was early September, and it didn't look like an old scarecrow either. It stood with its arms out and hat down over its eyes, bang in the middle of the field. I knew that field as well as I know my own face in the looking-glass. Then how could I have missed it? The following afternoon I stepped upstairs to have a look at it from the windows. There was less heat haze or something, and I could see it clearer, but not quite clear enough. So I whipped along to the Reverend's study, him being still, poor gentleman, confined to his bed. In fact, he never got up from it. I whipped along, I say, to fetch his binoculars, and I fastened them on that scarecrow. You will hardly credit me, sir, when I say it didn't look quite real. I could watch it with the glasses as plain as if it had been in the touch of my hand, even to the hatband. It wasn't the first time I'd set eyes on the clothes either, though I couldn't have laid name to them. And there was something in the appearance of the thing which wasn't what you'd expect of mere sticks and rags. I called George. His face was still discoloured, though his affair in the stable-yard was now a good 3 weeks old. Take a squint through these glasses, George, I said. Tell me what you make of that thing over there. George was a slow, dawdly mug, if ever there was one. But he fixed the glasses at last. Why, Mr. Blake, it's a scarecrow. Does the air around it strike you as funny at all? I asked him, quivering in a manner of speaking. That's the heat, he said, but his lips trembled. Well, George, I said, heat or no heat, you or me must have a look at that thing closer. Not this afternoon, it's too late. But we didn't, sir. For lo and behold, when I got up next morning and went along the corridor to have another glance at it, it wasn't there. The scarecrow, sir, was vanished. Some farmer's lout, I thought to myself, must have moved the old mommet overnight. But that being so, what was it ever put up for? Harvest done and all that. I didn't go out that day, but all day long, and I'll vouch for it, the whole 20 acres of that field lay empty. And when the moon came up that evening, I took yet another squint through the glasses from the upper windows, and I'm ready to own that something inside of me gave a sort of hump, sir, when, large as life, I saw that the scarecrow was come back again. But what I saw the instant before I began to look, and to that I'd lay my affidavit, was something moving, and pretty rapid too, and it was only as I clapped the glasses onto it that it suddenly fixed itself into what I already supposed I should find it to be. I've noticed that before. It's your own mind that learns you before what you look at turns out to be what you expect. Else why should we be alarmed by this here solid sometimes? It all looks so, but is it? Well, sir, I must say that from that moment on, I didn't like the look of things, and never have I shared a meal so mum as when George and me had supper that evening. From being a hearty eater, his appetite was fallen almost to a cipher. It was while we sat there, alone in the servants' hall, that we heard some words said. Not what you could understand, but still words. I couldn't tell from where, except that it wasn't from the Reverend. George stopped munching, his face little short of green. But except for a cockling up inside of me, I didn't make any sign I'd heard. Lock-up time came at last, and George took his candle and went up to bed. Not quite as willing as usual, I fancied. As for me, I gave a last look in on the old gentleman. All well there, and him lying as peaceful as if the end had come already. Then, coming back along the corridor, I blew out my candle and stood waiting at the windows. The moon came streaming in, and outside was almost as bright as day. But there was nothing to be seen, nor heard neither. Yet it seemed that not more than one deep breath after I had closed my eyes in sleep that night that I was wide awake again. There was something sounding about the house that wasn't natural, and no mistake. As soon as I heard it, I was on with my tailcoat over my nightshirt in a jiffy. I'd fetched my winter coat too, this very coat on my back now, and with that over my arm I pushed open the door and looked in on George. Maybe he'd heard my coming. Maybe he'd heard the other. But there he was, sitting up in bed, the moonlight flooding in on his long white face. I said to him, "What's wrong, George?" He sat looking at me with his mouth open, and I could see he was shaken to the very roots. Now, what I'd heard might be some animal prowling around outside, or it might not. If not, and the house being exorcised, as I said, I'd a kind of trust that what was there, if it was anything, couldn't get in. But naturally, I was in something of a fever to make sure. "George," I said, "it's up to us, our duty, George, to know what's what. So, if you'll take a look around on the outside, I'll have a search through on the inn." George went on looking at me, though he had by this time shuffled out of bed and into the overcoat I'd handed him. "You don't think, Mr. Blake, you don't think he's come back again?" "Who's come back, George?" I asked. "Why, what we looked through the glasses at in the field. It had his look." "Well, George," I said, speaking as she might to a child, "we know as how dead men tell no tales, let alone scarecrows then. All we got to do is to make sure. You do as you're bid then, my lad. You go your ways, and I'll go mine." "I'd leave us not go down, Mr. Blake," he said. "Leastways not alone. He said it'd be evens, not alone, Mr. Blake." "What have you to fear, George, my lad? Man or spectre, the fault was none of yours." George buttoned up the coat, and the moon on his face gave him a queer look, far away like, as if all that there was of him, this world, all the next, had come to keep him company. It was the last between us. He turned his back on me and went off out into the passage. As for myself, I didn't move for a bit. There wasn't any hurry that I could see, and then presently what I heard was as though a voice had said something very sharp and bitter, then said no more. There came a sort of moan, then no more again. But by that time, I was on my way on my rounds inside the house, and when I got back to my bedroom again, everything was quiet. And I took it, of course, that George had got back safe to his. Since the fire had faded, the fish-like phosphorescence of the gas mantles had grown brighter, and this elderly man was looking at me out of his white, almost leper-like face in this faint gloom, as steadily as George must have been looking at him a few minutes before he had descended the back stairs of the vicarage, never, I gathered, to return. "He wasn't found till morning," the old man said. "Cold for hours, and precious little to show why. Did you manage to get a little sleep?" He made no answer. "Your share, I suppose, was quite a substantial one." "Share? In the will?" "Now, sir, didn't I tell you myself that, as it turned out, wasn't so? And I don't know as what I did get has brought me anything much to boast about. I'm a free man, that's true, but for how long?" He peered round and out of the door. "And though in this world you may not have one iota of harm to blame yourself for to yourself, may still be misunderstandings, and them that have been deceived by them may be waiting for you in the next. So when it comes to what the captain of the Hesper—" But at this moment our tete-a-tete was interrupted by a young porter carrying a bucket of coal, which he emptied onto the fire. Then he looked round. Me he passed over, but he greeted my fellow derelict as if he were an old acquaintance. "Good evening, sir," he said in that slightly indulgent voice which suggests past favours rather easily earned. "I didn't see you when I came in and was beginning to wonder where you'd got to." His patron smirked back at him, as if any such trifling human attention was a peculiar solace. This time the porter caught my eye, and his own was full of meaning. It was as if there was some ironical understanding between us which this third party was unlikely to share. I ignored it, rose to my feet. A train had come hooting into the station. It wasn't mine, but I preferred my own company just then. When I reached the door, I glanced back at Mr. Blake, sitting there in his great coat. With a mournful look, he seemed to be deploring the withdrawal of my tepid companionship. But in that dreadful, gaseous luminosity there was nothing, so far as I could see, that any mortal man could by any possibility be afraid of, alive or dead. So I left him to the porter, and, as yet, we have not met again.